austerity for the private sector, which I think is actually quite apt.
Differences between this government and the previous one, they're not that colossal on the fiscal side.
Just the NHS has not been under austerity. It has got huge amounts of money pumped into it.
I saw the IFS saying that this is for living standards and for disposable incomes, this will be the worst parliament on record except for the last one. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clougherty, Executive Director of the IEA, and I'm joined this week by two of my colleagues, Daniel Freeman, our Managing Editor, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. Our goal is to bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and the shallow political commentary you may get elsewhere, and instead focus on the big ideas and underlying principles that matter to classical liberals. This week, it's a wall-to-wall budget special. We'll be picking over Chancellor Rachel Reeves' first budget delivered this week, asking about her tax increases, her spending plans, and the overall effect on the economy, and one or two other things besides. Kristian, why don't we start with you and just the overall impact of this budget in fiscal and economic terms? What's your take on it?
Yes, so the macroeconomic summary of this is relatively simple. This budget is going to lead to a permanent increase in government spending by a little more than 2 percentage points of GDP. Of that, a little over half is going to be financed through additional taxation. The rest comes from additional borrowing. And that additional spending is going to be roughly 2/3 consumptive spending and 1/3 additional investment expenditure. And about the growth impact, if the OBR's modeling is correct, their forecast is that this is going to lead to a short-lived increase in economic growth. It's going to lead to a slight growth uptick lasting for about 2 years. Then that impact is going to disappear. So even though there's going to be additional government expenditure, consumption and investment, that is going to be exactly offset by a reduction in household consumption and business investment. So this is just a straightforward redistribution from the private sector to the public sector. And that could not be otherwise. The reason for that is simply that again, according to the OBR's modeling, you could say this is a Keynesian budget, but we are in a non-Keynesian situation. So for a Keynesian stimulus package to work, you would need a situation where there is a lot of spare capacity in the economy, where you have productive resources that are just not being used, and then the Keynesian stimulus package ideally would utilize those spare capacities, would bring those resources back into use. But that is not the situation we are in. We are already close to the maximum of. We are already using most of the capacity, the productive capacity that we have in the economy. Meaning, what we have now, this is about as good as it gets, and that is why, if you just take the productive capacity as given and increase demand somewhere, you're just going to get a reduction somewhere else. You can't increase output in that way, and that is why any pro-growth impact that this budget is going to be short-lived.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we take this modelling with a pinch of salt. It's quite useful for illustrative reasons, but I suppose some of us, and maybe people listening and watching as well, might question some of the intellectual foundations of those kind of models, and also sort of marvel at the absurdity of the Chancellor standing up in the House of Commons and reeling off the growth statistics for the next 6 years and the inflation statistics for the next 6 years, as if once you go beyond a year or two out, they really tell you very much at all. But I think there's maybe a slightly longer term story with the way the OBR forecast it, because initially, as you say, fiscal loosening, they think, boosts the economy, and then those private sector effects of higher taxes and crowding out of public spending send it dipping back down again. And then in the long run, you get a little uptick of growth again, because the effect of these extra capital projects that the government now feels able to spend will supposedly at that point in time start delivering some kind of returns. Now, I think you can ask questions at pretty much every step of that process. But that, I guess, would be the standard macroeconomic take on what's happening.
Yeah, and also the sort of growth that they are projecting, even in the next sort of year or two, which you can probably place a bit more faith in than stuff, 6 years down the road. It isn't exactly, the Barber boom or anything. They're talking about sort of 2% growth, maybe, in the next year, mostly driven by increasing public sector spending, which isn't great at all if you compare it to the sort of long run trend growth that we've had, up to the global financial crisis. And then over the course of this parliament, they're sort of projecting, I think, 1.5 to 1.6% GDP growth per annum. And when you factor in that, over the last few years, Britain's population has been growing by about 1% a year or near enough, you're talking about standards of living that are basically flatlining.
I saw the IFS saying that this for living standards and for disposable incomes, this will be the worst parliament on record except for the last one. So at least on these numbers, it's not looking great. Why don't we pursue this kind of growth angle on the budget a little bit first? Because I think one of the interesting things was how explicit the sort of pro-growth framing was at the beginning of the speech. And then it seemed to me there was almost nothing actually contained in the budget that would do anything to encourage growth. Okay, yes, a little bit more capital spending, but when you look at the capital spending, obviously not all investment is created equal. And I think there are things that the government can spend money on that might have long-run growth effects. You can always ask the question, would that money actually be better spent and more productively spent in the private sector? But if you assume the government's going to spend some money, easing transport bottlenecks would be a good thing to do for the supply side of the economy. Probably anything that would lead to cheaper energy, for example, even if you don't want a state-driven approach, if you're going to have one anyway, you can see how that would help too. Actually, it looks like in real terms, transport investment is falling. Most of this new investment is going towards net zero related projects, which the government obviously thinks is going to create green growth and green jobs galore. I think this is another one of those convenient fantasies that eventually people will probably grow out of. And a lot of it otherwise is going towards schools and hospitals and spending money on schools and hospitals, upgrading buildings and providing equipment and so on. These are probably good things, that we would welcome, all things being equal. But are they doing an awful lot for economic growth, for the supply potential of the economy? I don't think so.
Well, our former colleague, Matthew Lash, has called this austerity for the private sector, which I think is actually quite apt because, the idea behind austerity in the traditional sense is that you're cutting back or restraining spending growth in the public sector, and then the private sector sort of expands to take up some of the sort of employment loss. But here you're getting the vast majority of the sort of cuts coming in the private sector. So with increased national insurance contributions, and then the hope is that you throw, and then you borrow some extra, you throw back an extra £70 billion into the public sector. That will solve the problems that are caused by the previous government, apparently. And then people 5 years down the line will forgive you for the tax increases or will have forgotten about it. That's the sort of theory behind it.
Yes. Yeah, but I think they're staking a lot on things improving because despite the increase in taxes and despite there being actually that usual kind of fictional spending restraint in the later years of the forecast window, conveniently to make sure that they can hit their targets. Despite that, the headroom against the fiscal rules, the revised fiscal rules, is actually extremely small. And especially when you consider things like the fact that, fuel duty, if they froze it this year, they will probably keep freezing it in future years as well. Probably they'll end up topping up those forecast spending totals in years 3, 4 and 5. And there are a bunch of other things as well that mean that even the spending targets they've given themselves, they're probably not actually going to hit. So it seems to me, actually, they're depending an awful lot on getting some economic growth over the course of this 5-year parliament. But they're not putting very much in this budget that's likely to encourage it. Now, I think you would say, Kristian, and I would accept, an awful lot of things we need to do to promote growth are not actually fiscal measures right now. So perhaps we shouldn't judge too harshly. Perhaps they have an ace up their sleeve that's going to deliver bumper growth. It just wasn't in the budget. Can you speculate as to what that might be?
Well, I'd be surprised because although it is, of course, a theme that we keep returning to in this podcast is that whatever complaints we may have about the fiscal situation, that is not where Britain is exceptionally bad. That is not the reason why we've had a near stagnant economy for 1.5 decades. It really is the supply side bottlenecks that hold us back. We keep returning to the Foundation's essay. They spell this out, and they also make clear that even to the extent that you think that public investment has a role to play, well, even there, the problem with things like infrastructure investment here is that we just get less infrastructure for every unit of spending. That they show very clearly that for comparable projects in France and Italy, they just get a lot more bang for the buck. They get a tram network for the kind of money that we just spend on the application for something that then never gets built. And it's that sort of thing. If she sorted that out, then you could either from the given transport investment budget, you could generate bigger growth effect, or you could then even justify higher spending because the kind of project that makes economic sense, there would then be just more of those. And it is in that sense, really, that the big things that we need to do are on the non-fiscal side. But that's why I think it's a bad sign that they start putting political energy now in a budget like that, because actually we don't need a budget right now. You know, they could have waited until March. Budgets happen in March normally before the new fiscal year. And although, of course, there are some differences between this government and the previous one, they're not that colossal on the fiscal side to justify coming up with a new budget right now. I think they should have just let the budget that we had in place run its course, let it naturally expire in March, and make a few tweaks here and there. Maybe if they want to spend more on the NHS, that could all have been done without a new budget. I think they should really now have focused purely on the supply side measures, on the regulatory side, and say the fiscal stuff, we will wait until we have a proper plan for infrastructure, housing, energy, water reservoirs, all that sort of thing, the economic foundations, and then let the OBR do its modeling on that basis rather than with the supply side conditions that we currently have.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the few rays of light in terms of growth in the OBR report, is they do say we, Labour are planning, the government are planning reforms on planning, and we haven't factored those into our calculations. These could be a big sort of upside risk in terms of actually stimulating growth, and it's pretty much the only avenue Labour have left, because it's pretty clear they're not going to do much about cheap energy. They're prioritising rapid decarbonisation over that. So really it's planning reform, which is the last card they have.
Yeah. I mean, I think to be fair, we're going to be doing budgets in October now, I'm told, and the thing in March ahead of the new financial year will just be a sort of update on the macro forecast. Rachel Reeves is not the first Chancellor to say there's only going to be one big fiscal event a year. They always they love the political theatre of it. They love the opportunity to make tax changes, generate headlines, and so on. So I expect we'll probably get back into having effectively 2 budgets a year and constant tinkering with the tax system. But for now, at least, it's an October budget, and so perhaps we can forgive them for doing a budget now rather than in the spring. I think you raised this actually, that is it that different from the budgets delivered by its immediate predecessors, this government's budget? And I think it's quite interesting to pick out some of the themes of continuity between previous Tory budgets and this one. And, for example, Rishi Sunak originally increased national insurance, and then, of course, he cut it. And now the government has put it back up again. Now, it's gone down on the employee side and it's ended up going up on the employer side. But because of where the incidence of the tax falls ultimately, it doesn't make a great deal of difference. Yes, they've changed the fiscal rules, so they're forecasting or they're aiming for a current budget balance and falling debt on a revised measure in the third year of the forecast rather than the fifth year of the forecast. But yet again, this will be one of those rolling targets that you never actually reach. Things will always look good 3 years from now, but never quite yet. Again, continuity there. I think that's reflected in the way that the spending is front-loaded and what many people would say, given political constraints, are unrealistic degrees of spending constraint in the later years of the forecast. Again, we've done that. We see the capital spending high now, but low later. You see, as I mentioned before, fuel duty, frozen this year, but of course it will rise every other year in the forecast, but will it really? One suspects probably not. You had just constant and comprehensive leaking of the contents of this budget in the run-up to it. Another sign of sort of continuity there. And of course, the lack of real vision in terms of how are we going to generate greater growth? How are we going to reform, ideally shrink the state? All of that is absent. So the personalities have changed. The framing is different. And I do think if this had been a Tory Chancellor, because Conservatives still sort of think of themselves as the party of low tax, even if at the end of their 14 years in government, the tax take was an all-time high. Let's gloss over that for a second. They would have had some sort of tax giveaways in there. But ultimately, if you step back from all of that, things haven't really changed that much, have they?
Well, there was the one tax giveaway. We now have draft beer in pubs 1 penny cheaper than they otherwise would have been, which is actually another example of continuity. It's a very easy sort of...
It's a gimmick.
Yeah. So a rabbit, like, okay, the duty you're paying on draft beer in pubs is 1p cheaper, but also the minimum wage has gone up significantly. You've also got higher energy bills. You've got increased employer national insurance contributions. So no one's beer is actually going to get cheaper, but it allows you to do quite a good infographic on Twitter, which is pretty much the same thing that previous Tory governments have done.
Well, I mean, infographic is this doing some work. It showed a glass of beer and the word cheaper.
well, yeah. That was it. 2014, where the Tories came out with their beer and bingo poster, giving British working people what they like.
Yes, I mean, it does seem quite likely that the 1 penny change is likely to be pocketed by the pub owners, right, rather than being passed on to the consumers.
Yeah. It makes no difference. It costs very...
£7.98p for your local pint in Westminster or something. All right, well, we brought up some of the tax changes. Why don't we just focus on the tax changes in this budget for a few minutes? And so this was, at least according to the scorecard, a massively tax-raising budget, an extra 40 billion odd in terms of tax revenue. Now, I say according to the scorecard because actually the biggest measure there was a £25 billion increase in employer national insurance contributions. They both increased the rate of tax from 13.8% to 15%. They also broadened the base. So previously, employer national insurance contributions have kicked in on earnings above, I think it was 9,100. That's dropping down to around 5,000 now, I think. And it's actually the broadening of the base which is doing the heavy lifting in terms of the extra revenue there, more so than the rate, although obviously that is significant as well. But the reason I say on the scorecard is because actually the OBR makes clear something that we had talked about before on this podcast, and we had some research out over the weekend saying much the same thing, that because basically because employer national insurance contributions will get passed through in various ways, mostly onto employee wages, but it could also result in
fewer people being hired,
etc. Or it could reduce profits, or it could it could raise prices in the shops and therefore reduce private spending a little bit as well. You take those things into account, and actually it raises about 10 billion less than you would have expected, ultimately because there's less income being earned one way or another to tax. But nevertheless, even if you talk about a tax increase in the low 30s of billions, this is quite significant. And we were already at an all-time high. We're going to a new, even higher all-time high in terms of tax revenue. We also saw changes to capital gains tax. The main rate for high rate taxpayers went up from 20 to 24. I think in a way a lot of people were quite relieved because there'd been speculation that it would be aligned with the rate on dividends, which is 39.1%, or maybe a little higher than that. Didn't go there. A couple of things though on capital gains that I'm not sure people immediately twigged and which I think could potentially be quite important. One is that business asset disposal relief, bad. The tax rate on the first, so basically this applies when an entrepreneur sells their business. And so the first $1 million in lifetime gains from selling a business is subject to a lower rate of tax. And it was 10%, it's going up to 14%, then it's going to 18% over the next 2-3 years. That's quite a chunky increase. And also bear in mind that under the Conservatives, I think the total amount of capital gains that was eligible for that release fell, I think maybe from 10 billion and down to 1 million. So the tax treatment for business founders has become and is going to become significantly less generous than it was. There are also increases in the rate of capital gains tax charged on carried interest over the next couple of years. And then sneakily, I think, in the small print, there is a consultation on whether to go further and just tax carried interest effectively as income. After that, I think you can argue both sides of that coin. It's very clear, though, that if you're thinking about Britain as a kind of internationally competitive economy, competing for business founders, competing for, say, hedge fund businesses and so on, these are potentially problematic. Inheritance tax, again, I think most kind of tax nerds would say that the changes they made to inheritance tax in terms of broadening the base were sort of basically sensible if you wanted to increase inheritance tax. Now, of course, I think inheritance tax should probably be scrapped in an ideal world, so it wouldn't have been the way I went, but never mind. And then, of course, you've got stamp duty land tax, which, first of all, there was no indication, and no indication was expected, to be fair, that the government would continue the higher threshold for stamp duty, which under the last government was doubled temporarily in a time-limited way from 125,000 to 250,000. That tax cut is going to lapse, so that will be a tax increase for anyone buying a house of several £1,000s, I think, from next April onwards. But they've also raised the surcharge on second properties from 2 to 5%, which means actually, if you think the top standard rate of stamp duty land tax is 12%, add 5% onto that as a marginal rate, 17%. So I think, and that would apply, by the way, not just on a second property you owned in the UK, but if you were a kind of international businessman, investor, whatever, and you wanted to buy a place in London, potentially you would be facing an extremely high, and much higher than it used to be, marginal tax rate. I think all of these things taken together, individually you can sort of wave them away and say, oh, not as bad as expected. You know, this is just kind of what you bank on with a new government with left-wing heritage. But I think take all of those things together, along with some of the other tax changes that we've seen recently, and it is a significant worsening in our attractiveness to international capital. And quite possibly is only the start of heading further along those lines. Of course, I didn't mention non-dom status, which is going to be abolished as well. In almost every single case, there are much better ways of taxing in these areas. And so you might want to sweep away everything you've got at the moment and have something entirely different take its place. I get that. But nevertheless, I do think this is kind of a bad move overall taken in the round.
And I think that is reflected in I think it's the Tax Foundation, which does this tax competitiveness ranking, which isn't so much about the overall tax burden. You could in principle have a very high tax level, but all raised in a relatively non-distortionary way, and they just look mostly at the distortions that the tax system is causing. And this would be an example where, a variety of examples in the budget where the tax system is made more distortionary because it singles out specific activities and goes heavy on those. And this is, of course, not a complete coincidence that they do this, because these are all taxes that are not that visible to the average Joe. And it's where you have to, first of all, explain what this even does. Mostly taxes that most people may not even have heard about. And in this way, you can hide the true incidence for a while. You can hide the fiscal impact. But what all of this is, of course, going to do is it will, for example, discourage transactions that you may have businesses staying with an owner for longer than ideally they should, and where somebody else might be able to make better use of that business. And when you reduce the volume of transactions, that's always going to lead to economic inefficiencies. But this is what happens when you have a government that wants to raise taxes and public spending, but which doesn't want to go the full Swedish, Danish way of saying you can have all those public services, but it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
And that's this old cliche again of people wanting American taxes, but Swedish public services, but it's also kind of true. And that's why we don't get that honest communication of saying this is the kind of state, this is the kind of level of public spending, public services that we want, but this is going to cost you, and here's the bill.
Yeah. And of course, VAT and business rates on private schools was in the mix as well.
Yeah, which, personally, and I actually have no particular objection to VAT on private schools. I think one of the big problems with our, with British VAT is it is unusually complex, has a huge number of exemptions, which are very distortionary and cost an awful lot of money. So I think the IFS put the costs of various zero rates and lower rates for VAT at about £70 billion in foregone revenue. And on top of that, you add an element of friction into the economy as you have different companies trying to sort of game the system and work out what is susceptible to VAT and what isn't. But Labour the government have done nothing on this. And that's really quite disappointing, because if you are going to have a big tax-raising budget, if you're going to be like, right, we're raising a massive amount of extra tax right at the start of the parliament in order to spend more, it seems like one of very few times in which you could actually have political support for serious reform to VAT or serious reform to the tax system more broadly. But they've decided to not do that. They've decided to do the tinkering model that just distorts the system more and inhibits growth.
I mean, as you know, I'm all for broadening the VAT base and sweeping reform there. And maybe this seems logically inconsistent. I am uneasy with the application of VAT to private schools and business rates as well, because it's not coming as part of a comprehensive reform. It's singling out a particular kind of business or service that the government has just decided they don't like and they disapprove of. Now, on the same basis, universities charge fees. Why aren't universities' fees subject to VAT and business rates?
They probably should be.
And what about all other kinds of educational services as well?
But do you not think that sort of undermines the argument of those who are in favour of a simpler, more predictable tax system? Is if we say this in the abstract, but as soon as it comes for industries that we like or might want to send our children to, we suddenly start getting a bit uneasy about it. And I'm like, it's there are lots of industries that we approve of in one way or another, but we do have to raise tax revenue somehow, and VAT is a pretty sensible way to do that.
I think that. Well, are you doing some research on this as well? Is there something in the pipeline?
Yes. Yeah. So what my own view is that if your concern about VAT, which and there have been legitimate concerns that introducing VAT will lead lots of people at the lower end of the private school market sort of dropping out. A far more effective way of subsidizing those people is to just give them a flat amount of money, like New Zealand does, because that is a bigger subsidy for those at the lower level than a VAT exemption, which is basically, the more expensive the school you go to,
the greater the saving.
The greater the savings.
That kind of applies across the piece with VAT.
Yeah, that's why it's it's generally a very, very inefficient way of supporting people on lower incomes, because if you want to do that, well, just use the tax and universal credit to just subsidize people directly.
I think that's probably what I would do as well, actually. Have comprehensive VAT, and then for something like private schools where you're declining to use a taxpayer-funded service that you'd otherwise be entitled to, giving some kind of flat rate, could be a tax credit, could be a voucher, various ways you could structure it, probably pegged in some way to the per-pupil spend in the state sector.
Which in the case of education should be relatively easy, because you can just go by the average cost per pupil that you otherwise have. There are attempts to do this. I've written about the Australian healthcare system where they try to give you tax rebates if you have private health insurance. There it's a lot trickier, not just because healthcare needs differ from person to person, but also it isn't quite clear, do the people who have private health insurance, do they really use the public system less, or is it that they just use both and use private healthcare for additional optional treatments? In the case of education, it's a lot more straightforward than that. You can work out the cost, and you're not going to go to both a public and a private school at the same time. Then, so you don't have that duplication.
You really love studying.
Well, even then, there'll probably be more efficient ways to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to one last kind of big picture topic to come out of this budget, and that's the size of the state. So I think by the end of the decade, both tax and spending are going to be 5 percentage points of GDP higher than they were before the pandemic. So this is a huge step change, basically, in the size of the state in government. And it's also not clear that we're actually getting any more, anything else that we want out of it. Why has this happened? Is this economic scarring effects of the pandemic? Actually, I don't think so. I think probably we've kind of got back to the trend line where the economy is roughly the sort of size you would have expected pre-pandemic at this point in time. We just have a lot more spending than we did before, and taxes going up accordingly. But what's going on? Can we reverse this, do you think?
Well, the fact that it happened so quickly shows that this isn't the usual thing driven by long-term factors that we normally talk about, like demographic factors. So the demography of the country doesn't change that drastically in 5 years. This is really a political choice. But I think even before the pandemic, what happened was there was already a public demand for this, which is why after Cameron, Conservative prime ministers from Theresa May onwards tried to signal we're past the austerity years, that was a sin of youth, we're not going to do that again. That was already there, and this is just a continuation of that. They were bad at communicating it. They were still perceived as an austerity government for much longer than they truly were. But the actual period of spending restraint, that was all concentrated in the early 2010s, and then it was over. And now we just see an acceleration of that. I think that the change from the Conservatives to this government is simply that with the Conservatives there was still a small state rhetoric, and so the budget may have looked similar under a Conservative Chancellor, but they would still have said, but our ambition still remains for the state to be smaller and lower taxes. Whereas now they're more unapologetic about it. It's clearer that we're now getting the kind of budget that the government really wants us to have. Whereas with the previous ones, there would have been, we are in the abstract a small state government. We just don't want to talk about any particular function of the state. We're not prepared to revise it.
We're just no longer in denial about what direction we're heading. Like, if you look at the previous projection from March 2024, it sort of has us down to only 42% state spending as a proportion of GDP, which is still really, really high in historic terms, now is going to be 44% as well. So, if they stick to their spending targets, which I'm not entirely sure they will, because as you mentioned, it involves a lot of restraint in the 2 years before a general election, which governments are very reluctant to do most of the time. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is a product of how austerity kind of was done, in that it was about the state stopped doing very few things. It just stopped spending as much money on them. Now, in some areas where you actually had sort of serious and intelligent reform of how the state goes about things, like in education, this actually worked out really quite well. So day-to-day spending on education per pupil fell by about 9% between 2010 and 2019. And yet, if you look at performance, if you look at Britain's international performance compared to peers in things like the PISA studies, we improved dramatically and improved a lot. English pupils improved a lot more than Scottish pupils, who actually were going into reverse, even though they didn't have the same spending constraints. And so that's an example of the state actually, being more successful while not constantly expending. But then you have other areas, particularly in like local government, where you have really quite severe spending constraints, but more and more stuff being lumped on them.
Yeah.
And so it just means that a lot of the public sector just ends up looking like it carries on. It's just a bit crap. And so when a Labour government comes in, what they think, understandably, is like, okay, everything's a bit crap. We just throw more money at it. That will solve it. And then maybe growth will handle itself, maybe. But, I'm not necessarily very optimistic about it.
Well, yeah, but that was always the problem with austerity, fiscal restraint, whatever you want to call it, that it was never a rethink of what do we want the government actually to do, what do we want to afford, starting from first principles. It was just, okay, let's do everything the state currently does, spend a bit less on it. You would never, if you had to consolidate your own household budget, and I know a lot of people hate it when you compare government budgets to household budgets, but you would never consolidate your own finances in that way. You wouldn't say, I'll carry on doing everything I do now, just a bit less on everything. You would really single out some things. Do I really need this subscription here? And you would go about it more strategically, single out things and ask yourself, do I really need to do this? And that's how you would do it. And austerity was just done in that way of spending a little bit less on everything across the board. And that created that backlash. And we're now...
Healthcare spending, of course, yes. and pensions. And also, actually, healthcare is quite interesting because that is seen, by the time the Conservatives left office, that was seen as one of their biggest sort of black marks in terms of the actual performance of public services. People's biggest complaint was NHS waiting times. And yet, just the NHS has not been under austerity. It has got huge amounts of money pumped into it, and yet its performance has got worse and worse. And Labour's thinking, I suppose, is that, well, we just pump in a bit more. That will solve the problems that weren't previously solved by pumping in more money than this. And then, it'll be fine.
And I think across the board, the obvious conclusion to draw here is that reform is needed. We cannot keep doing things the way we're doing and expect different results. Ultimately, it's not all about money. Otherwise, you're just kind of going around in circles over time, swinging one way, swinging the other, but nothing really changes. Whether it's regulation, applying to development, housing, energy, whether it's how we organise healthcare, or, various other functions of the welfare state, we just need to think through some serious reforms, as they did in education, and enact them. Sounds easy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There you go, problem solved.
Yeah, there we are. All right. So, I mean, why don't we just finish with our own sort of one-statement conclusions on the budget? I mean, I think mine would probably be, I'll steal Matthew Lesch's private sector austerity point. I think if you're looking at this budget as a business, you're going to be feeling pretty unhappy about it, because not only are you seeing a massive increase in the minimum wage, you're seeing a huge increase in your employer national insurance contributions, and you're facing a massive expansion of the employment rights coming along separately in the background. You had the corporation tax rate rise basically by a third just 18 months ago. There's really not a lot of nice stuff to look at here. And it seems to be, to me, reflective of the government taking the approach that, the private sector isn't going to do much for growth anyway. That's on us through capital spending. Seems to me that this is an approach that's more or less doomed to failure. Kristian?
Well, I know the ultimate journalistic cliche after budgets is to describe them as a missed opportunity. I think this one wasn't a missed opportunity because there never was much of an opportunity to begin with. The biggest problems we have are not on the fiscal side. And if you were expecting an economic impetus, it wasn't going to come from any kind of budget. We need to sort out other things first, and then the fiscal side will almost take care of itself.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's basically a budget that is us as a country sort of treading water. And the hope is that eventually you will get some sort of reforms to planning law, maybe something on the energy side, maybe just we'll get really lucky in some unspecified way, and then that is the lifeboat that saves us before we freeze to death.
On that cheery note, we'll draw things to a close. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We hope we'll see you again next week. In the meantime, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and follow us on Substack, insider.iea.org.uk, for more from all of us. Until then, thank you.